Hello and welcome to today's webinar. The topic today is supply chain and procurement metrics. How are you performing? I'm your moderator, Subro Sen. Thank you for joining us. If you have any questions during the webcast, you can click on the Q&A widget that you can find it on your screen. Our speaker will answer these questions at the end of the presentation. I would like to introduce our presenter now. Bill Michels, CEO at Airpart Cosulting, helps companies transform business strategies into maximum profits. He's a leading expert in purchasing and supply chain management. He has worked with some of the world's greatest companies across a wide spectrum of industries and countries, transforming procurement and the supply chain. Well known in the purchasing and operations management community and food and pharma industries, Bill is sought-after speaker and writer with many publications, including co-author of the book, Transform Your Supply Chain. He is now working on a new book focused in the area of supplier relationship management and published numerous articles. Bill has a BS in Business Administration from Rochester Institute of Technology and an MBA from Baldwin Wallace University. He has CPSM, CPM, and FCIPS certifications. He is on the board of directors of the Joe Niekro Foundation as well. With that, I now turn over to Bill for the presentation.
Hello, everybody. We're going to talk about metrics today, and we're going to cover a whole range of topics. We're going to cover what CEOs want from purchasing and supply chain management. We're going to talk about what is the need for metrics and how are the metrics changing? They're changing radically as we get to the digital disruption, and we're starting to look at how we need to change our own businesses, and then how do we need to get the suppliers to perform, and how do we need to perform to match what's going on. And we'll talk a little bit about that. I do have a matrix in there to talk about whether we have the competence and the capability to measure, and we'll talk about building effective KPIs. We'll look at probably more than 10. I know I put more than 10 metrics in there, so we'll talk about a lot of metrics for purchasing and supply chain management. And I think when we come away from this webinar, it's my hope that you'll be able to think about what you're doing now and then see whether there's any changes needed, or look at what you could do to measure. You know, I go back to Dr. Deming, the father of lean manufacturing, and what Dr. Deming once said is, without data, you're just another person with an opinion. So hopefully we can identify the right kinds of data, pull in the data, and start to measure what we do. Let's start with what CEOs want from purchasing supply chain. One thing they want is a good, efficient, lean process. They want to drive efficiency. We want to have inventoryless systems. We have integration across the suppliers. We really want to get to a good process. And I'll talk a little bit more about all four of these. And if you're in procurement or supply chain, you're never going to get away from cost improvement. You're going to have to drive cost improvement year on year on year, and that's a critical factor in performance and measurement. The other thing that we are now being responsible for is value improvement. So what is value? How do we measure it? That's going to be a point that we talk about as we get into the webinar a little bit more, and then, you know, supplier. So how do we, what's the supply? You know, how are we protecting the company against risk? How are we getting the suppliers to invest and return? How are we getting the suppliers to make a investment in our business? So, you know, when we look at what the CEOs want, they want cost improvement, they want value improvement, they want you to look at the total cost of ownership, they want innovation, they want speed to market, and they want a supply base that's really flexible and has a high velocity. When we think about process, we actually have to think about how efficient and effective are we on a purchase-to-pay system, and then how well do we link to the supply chain. As we've all seen over the last couple couple of years, there's been a lot of consolidations in a lot of industry. I think what that's going to do is that's going to force us to pick a supply chain and drive that supply chain and then link the supply chain and get a supply chain that really links the business strategy with our business strategy. And over time, I think some of our supply chains will be competing supply chains. So as we start to think about it, that process, we want to start to link those suppliers. We want lean processes with ongoing waste reduction and continuous improvement. We really, if we're gonna have consolidated industries and we're gonna start to manage our suppliers in the whole chain, then we really have to have a good process for supplier relationship management. And we have to manage those suppliers to continuously give us cost and value improvement on an ongoing basis. And as part of the process, we've got to worry about risk management. We've got to make sure that we've identified the suppliers in the entire supply chain. In fact, tomorrow I'm writing a blog on mapping the supply chain. Risk management is a key part of our process, and we have to measure how good we are at it. One customer I worked with did a predictive model of their supply chain. They mapped the entire supply chain, and they identified which suppliers were going to be risky, the most risky, and then they put in a mitigation plan. So what they did is they mapped the suppliers, they looked at the future value, they looked at all the products, and they looked at where the most vulnerable suppliers were in the supply base. So that's a key piece, and that's going to be a piece that you really need to start thinking about. I was working in a computer industry last couple of weeks, and when they mapped their supply chain, they found that they had one supplier downstream 3 levels that basically had the one supplier supplying everybody in the industry. All right, and we do want velocity and flexibility. So that's a key part of the process. When we start thinking about cost improvement, we want an improvement in price, but not price alone. We really want to work with suppliers across the supply chain to not just impact price, but remove costs. So look at redundancies, look at how we can work together, look at how we can change specifications, look at how we can make it more efficient for both parties to get together, look at how we can fix the logistics problems, but not just price, but cost improvement. We really want to get to not only the price, but the cost improvement, the required investments, and the things that we need to do. TCO is a great approach, total cost of ownership, and we're going to want to get to that, but one of the key problems is the metrics. How do you measure every component of the cost over a life cycle and then impact these components and make it so that we improve the life cycle cost of whatever we are buying or doing? The next piece of cost improvement has to be that our suppliers have to be linked to our business strategy. And when we talk about that linkage, we've got to look at what value do they provide in that supply chain, and then we have to apportion our costs across to the value that we're getting back. Cost improvement is going to be a year-on-year challenge, and you're going to have to do it every year. So, you know, it's easy in the initial part to focus on price and take a little bit of margin out, but it's more difficult if you get into the second year and the third year, and when margins are reduced, you really got to take cost out. So that's another key piece. And then we should really have cost modeling and should really understand how to rationalize the supply base and reduce complexity. In fact, one of the clients I went to a couple of years ago was a food company, and they had 325,000 suppliers. And they had duplications and specification and everything because it was a lot of acquisitions. And one of the measures we want to look at is, you know, how concentrated do you have your suppliers? I mean, how many dollars do you have in maybe 10 or the first, we hopefully have 80% of our spend in 20% of the supply base. And that makes the supply base easy to use and makes it better as we start to see complexity reduction and rationalization. When we're talking about value, It's things like speed to market. It's things like getting innovation from the suppliers. Speed to market is really important. If you're in the pharmaceutical industry, it has everything to do with you can save a few dollars, but if you get to market first, you get the entire market. You get the competitive advantage, and you get the regulation on your side first, and you get the patent protection. It's really important. And I'm working in the U.S. in the home building business, and one of the things that's kind of interesting to think about is we can save money on some of the building products, but it's much more important to get the home built and sold so you recapture and make a profit on the investment you've made in land and everything else. Innovation, we really demand innovation from our suppliers, and we have to find ways of measuring the innovation and getting that supplier innovation into our company that's an increased value. We may get extra services from that supplier or things that we would do ourselves that supplier is going to do, and we want to align the supply base with the voice of the customer so that we look at the customer side. So we want to look at, how do we align the supply chain with customer demand for value, because our customers want more value. It doesn't matter whether you're in the indirect spend area or whether you're in the direct spend area. So the customer wants more value for money. So that's a key point. When we look at supply, we want to capture supplier investments. We want suppliers that invest, build bigger tools, expand capacity, add higher level staff. If you're in the services, give you a better return on investment for services. The one thing that's kind of interesting about the supply side was I'm not sure who knows Bill Michels from Spend Matters, but Pierre said something that I took to heart. He said, when you're selecting a supplier, you're not just picking that first supplier. You're actually building the architecture for the entire supply chain. And so when you're making a supplier selection, you're building your supply chain. So, we're building flexible networks is going to be a part of the supply. Make it flexible and make it have a high velocity so that we're not going to have inventory in the system. And if you start thinking about the future, we're going to align with suppliers, and we're going to have the Internet of Things start to help us with that alignment. So we're going to look at that, and we're going to understand that we're not going to be able to carry inventory. We need suppliers that are flexible, can make what we want when we want it, especially in the kind of environment we're in the supply chain. We definitely want to identify the best sources, especially if we're architecting the supply chain, and we've got to guarantee to our management that we're going to deliver the supply. So we really want to think about, with all of these demands that we've got from what CEOs expect, how do we change our metrics to kind of deliver the kinds of things that talk about increasing the velocity or improving the process or increasing. It's not good enough just to measure price, delivery, and service. That's not good enough anymore. We've got to have innovation, speed to market, all of the things that are going to drive us to the next level. So what happens when we look at metrics and what's happening? Here's what I see when I go and I look at customers. I see too many metrics. I see people trying to make metrics when the data is no good. The specifications aren't updated. The data in the system's not right. The supplier's data is not right. I see old data. People really don't know what they should be measuring. And I see constantly changing metrics with customers and suppliers. And then I see that sometimes the data is manipulated by interested parties and stakeholders. Sometimes they kind of manipulate what we're doing. So those are some of the issues that I see. But there's really a couple important points. And I'll go back to Dr. Deming again. And one of the things that Dr. Deming said is what gets measured gets managed. If you don't measure it, you can't fix it. You can't change it. You can't drive it to best in class, and you can't get to a leadership position. So what you measure and how you measure will result in what gets managed, and how you start to see improvement. And you just can't measure and do metrics for the sake of doing metrics. They've got to be meaningful, and they've got to generate results and continuous improvement in order for you to be effective in your job. So those are two really important points that we'll probably come back to at the end of the session. All right, so what we have to think about, and I'm going to show you a kind of a matrix to help you. What's the measuring competence that we have? Do we always know what to measure? Do we build meaningful KPIs? Do we involve and collaborate with all of our stakeholders across the business? Are they participating in the process? Are the suppliers participating in the process? And do you have an organization buy-in from your team? And do you have an organizational buy-in from the suppliers team? If you can't really automate the metrics, and certainly systems like Zycus can help you automate and capture the right metrics. If you can't automate them, it's going to be very difficult to capture them if you're relying on a hand process or a manual process, and you may not get all of the data, and it may not be as timely as you'd like. And if you think about it, if I am measuring something and I know what I need to measure, then I'm going to drive focus and direction. I'm going to make sure that that's what we're working on, and I'll go back to Dr. Deming, what gets measured gets managed. And so that's why it's very, very important to look at the focus and direction of the metrics. So one aspect, again, is competence. The other one is results. Do you get metrics that actually generate a positive return for you? Do you see improvement? Does it result in either increase in value or reduction in overall cost or productivity, or does it result in a process change that makes you more efficient? Those are the kinds of things that you want to think about when we're looking at results. We also want to know what's going to bring us more value. How is this bringing us more value? So if we do make a change and we understand how we want to measure it, are we getting increased value? And then finally, is there an acceptance across our stakeholder community, and are they really working and happy to participate in the change? So, are we doing those things? And then I always look at things like who has a responsibility for the metric, who has the authority to put it in and check it, and then who's accountable at the end of the day. So what we're going to look at next is a matrix that looks at the results and the competence. So we talked about what measurement competence is, and we talked about what the results are. So if our competence is pretty low, we'll call that inept. If our competence is low and the results are low, that's inept. If our competence is high and the results are high, I'll call it optimistic. If our competence is high and the results are low, it's paralysis. And then if our measurement competence is high and our results are high, I'll call that driven. And I'll take you through what each one of these quadrants mean. But I think this is a good chart to really understand, are we good at metrics or not? So when we ask the question, how are you doing and how does your metrics work, this is one way you might want to test it. All right, paralysis. Okay, high measurement capability, low results. We may spend too much time measuring and analyzing. We may not be able to get to understanding what the data means or what the metrics is telling us or how to drive that change. It's an inability to take that data and make something happen from it. And in a lot of cases, when we have paralysis in metrics, they're just not meaningful. It is not helping anybody. And we're kind of paralyzed to make anything happen. If we have high measurement capability and high results, we're driven. We always go for continuous improvement. We're constantly generating changes. We've really got that responsibility, accountability, and authority across the distribution of the metrics, and the company has a culture for excellence and process for action. When we're driven and we have a high competence and we put the right metrics in and we're starting to get those right results and we can make the rapid changes, that's the kind of results that we're going to want when we actually start to drive metrics. That's definitely the kind of changes that we expect from metrics. If we have no capability to measure and we have low results, we may do a lot of measuring of ineffective metrics. We may not have a good we may know what we have, but we don't have a good process for action. We don't have the ability to specify or capture performance, and the change management may not be a natural process. Now, I mean, I can tell you, I worked with one company in the appliance industry, and I have to say they were inept. For one thing, they lost control of their specifications quite a long time ago. So if you actually ordered anything to the blueprint and direct material, it would be wrong, right? So no matter what they measured, they didn't have their drawings updated, so they didn't know why the part wasn't working, and it was just totally inept. And they spent more time messing with parts than they did actually making good parts. Opportunistic is low measurement capability, high results. And it might be an empowered culture. They may have many issues, people may be dependent, and they may have some proven processes to help them without the metrics. But you know, I think the best place to be is driven. All right. So we want to drive supplier performance. We want to use meaningful key performance indicators. We gotta be assured that all of the stakeholders and the suppliers buy in. And I can give you a great example of in my career, one of the areas where nobody bought in. I was in a food company, and we were using glass jars and metal caps. And every now and then, the metal cap would fly off of the machine at 200 caps a minute, and they wouldn't go on. The jars didn't work. And we really started measuring. We started using statistical process controls. And then we really went after the suppliers for the specs. And one of the suppliers didn't want to give us the specs. In fact, it was one that was very diligent, that they've never given the specs out, the real specs out, to anybody. Well, we went after them. We brought them in as a team, both the glass companies and the cap company. And what we found was that at the low tolerance of the glass and the high tolerance of the caps, they didn't fit. They were never going to fit. And so we were able, the cap couldn't change, but we actually were able to get the glass mold to change so that we never had that problem again. But that problem had gone on for years and years and years. So without all of our quality folks and our engineers and our plant people and the suppliers, we would not have solved that problem. So we want to drive that supplier performance. We want to report regularly. We want to make sure we understand. We don't want too big a scope. We want a narrow scope for the kinds of metrics or the kinds of problems we're trying to solve. And we need to set targets and really drive excellent performance. So that's the kind of thing that we want to do when we're looking at driving supplier performance. So if we're looking at metrics, we got to understand they've got to be acceptable to the organization. Everybody has to really, it can't be outside of what the organization can adapt to and what the culture will accept. They've got to be timely. It's got to be important. You got to be able to drive comparisons and compare them. So they got to be compatible and comparable. So we can't have a different spec than our supplier. And I can't tell you how many times I've seen it both in my corporate career in purchasing and in consulting, where there's no compatibility between the way that the metrics are being used. They have to be simple. You can't make it very complicated or you won't get anything out of them. You won't even do them. And they got to be linked to kind of responsibility. They got to be easy. We said that automated is the best way to go. So if you've got them so they're cost effective, they're automated, it makes it easier for metrics. They got to be balanced. They can't be unfair. They got to be balanced and they got to be achievable. and they got to be customer focused. We aren't doing this for the supplier or for ourselves. We're doing it to make the customer's product better. They got to be meaningful. So there's a lot of things that we have to think about, what those metrics have to be and how we can create them. And we don't, I don't think we want too many. I think we want to look at them. And like I said before, for the metric to really work, it's got to be a collaboration. Everybody's got to be involved. And if you get the stakeholders involved and they buy in and collaboration with the suppliers, then you're going to have metrics that are going to drive high supplier performance. And the reporting, the suppliers are going to come to you and they're going to want to see how they're doing with the metrics, because if you improve their process and their quality, then they do better across their whole customer base, not just you. And even if it's a indirect service or a indirect product, you can do the same thing. So it works in both the direct world and it works in the indirect world. But you've got to think about, especially in the indirect, when you're looking at stakeholders, stakeholder alignment, and stakeholder engagement. So how do you drive them? When we think about key performance indicators, they got to be quantifiable. They got to be measurable and actionable. You got to have something that works. You got to have something that's critical to the success of your organization, ultimately the customer. Even if you're an indirect, your customer may be a stakeholder. They definitely have to be aligned with the business objectives. I think maybe 5 to 8 key metrics, and I even think 5 to 8 may be too many. I'd limit it to 3 or 4 critical metrics that are going to be meaningful and deliver you some results. It's not it's not really a point of let's throw everything at the supplier and pass off our responsibility. It's really got to be, we want to do these metrics because they're going to generate benefits for us, our customers, and they're going to make life easy. They're going to drive that cost and value improvement piece that we're looking for. And they got to be applied consistently throughout the company and the organization. What they can't be is they can't be vague, they can't be unclear, they can't be nice to knows and not actionable, they can't be exhaustive reports, can't be anything that people can say, oh no, that's not the right metric, can't be one-sided. And it can't just be we're going to put metrics in place because we want to put metrics in place. They can't be random, and they can't be developed without supplier input or stakeholder input. Honestly, that's not going to work. Right? They're not punitive message. They're not meant to punish the supplier. They're not meant to push off what we know is our accountability to a supplier. And I've seen that a lot of times. They can't be unrealistic or designed to deliberately cause failure. It can't be a really long list. And it can't be what I was saying before, a tactical tool to push off the risk. That's not the way metrics work. And without a goal of continuous improvement, they're not going to be any benefit, and they got to be achievable. So, what's really good about building the right kind of KPIs is if you build KPIs and you build them so that you do better than you did, and you keep stretching that goal, you're going to keep generating continuous improvement. And I think continuous improvement year in, year out is what the procurement and supply chain teams have to do. All right, so, this is a great thing. We're going to set our KPIs, we're going to implement them, we're going to improve them time on time on time. And, we're going to look at the cause and effect and the targets, we're going to drive a closure loop, we're going to get over a learning curve, we're going to continue to go up the learning curve if we keep changing the metric to make it more and more and more improved. We're going to implement the dashboard, we're going to know how to escalate things, and we're actually working for a value shift. We really want to create new value. So every time we drive metrics and we meet those metrics and set them again, we're improving the value. All right, so the impact of being done in isolation, I've gone over this in the workshop a lot. If they're only driven one way, they're going to be unrealistic, rigid, misaligned. lack value, and really they're not going to be any benefit to anybody. So what it'll generate if you do that in isolation, it'll just make your supplier fail and you fail. All right, and the output will be the business looks at that as poor performance. All right, back to Dr. Deming. You know, the Deming process, plan, do, check, act. What gets measured gets managed, and I believe in that. If you don't measure it, you can't manage it. It indicates a degree of process being made, and it really talks about whether you're able to do it. It's an essential part of the plan, do, check, act Deming cycle, a way of working. It moves away from being intuitive to objective and logical decision making, and it supports the core principles of strategic sourcing. Again, Dr. Deming said, without data, you're just another person with an opinion, and that makes perfect sense to me. Hopefully, it does to you too. So let's look at the metrics that's there that you can look at, different kinds of metrics, and see if they fit what you're doing, and see how that works. So one of the metrics so I've got a lot of metrics here, so we'll talk about them. Realized implemented cost savings. So this is a measurement of total cost savings as a percentage of annual spend. And the calculation is the total cost savings divided by the annual spend, and it measures the actual impact of what you're doing. So where that metric is very helpful is if you're really in a position where you're saving money and you want to show the company, you know, how well you're doing in terms of a ratio. Purchasing ROI, it justifies the investment for change in purchasing. The formula is really total spend, savings implemented, purchasing labor, benefits, outsourcing, and technology. It's really only the actual savings implemented. But I was doing a assessment of an automobile company, and when we looked at it, they had 11 people, 9 of which were transactional, doing over $3 billion in spend, leaving only 2 people to drive the purchasing savings. When we looked at what the savings were, and my company did an analysis, it was quite a small investment for a big savings. It was an investment of, I want to say, 5 people to generate $70 million in cost savings. So, you know, we used the purchasing ROI to kind of justify, you know, what we were doing. All right, so this one, cost avoidance. A lot of people like to rely on cost avoidance. I don't, but I'll tell you what the problems are with cost avoidance. So I'll give you a small example that I've seen lots of times. Let's say a supplier comes in with an 8% price increase, and the buying team is really good. They negotiate it back to 5%. Well, you've got a 3% cost avoidance, but you have a 5% increase. You didn't save anything. What cost avoidance is really the impact that purchasing has on a given situation. Another way that I see cost avoidance misused is you buy a piece of capital equipment and the first bid comes in at $50,000 and you negotiate it back to $40,000. Well, people will call that a savings. Well, you didn't spend any money, so it's not a savings. You avoided spending $10 million or 10,000 or 10 million just because you're there. But in fact, it's not a savings. So you have to be careful about using cost avoidance as a metric. It's good as a process to say, hey, you know, we could have had this impact. But let's say you're spending $50,000 on a machine, you only spend $40,000. You didn't save anything because you didn't spend it to begin with. And a cost savings is really, I spent this much money. I spent $10 today. I'm spending $9 tomorrow. So that's the difference between cost savings and cost avoidance. But a lot of people get that mixed up, and that's my view on it. You know, how many sole and single sources do you have, and what's the risk mitigation and risk management strategy? I already told you I have a bias about looking at the whole supply chain and trying to find risk across the entire supply chain. So how exposed is the company to risk? I was working with one company in biotechnology, and they spent $250 million, and they had a $7 billion profit plan. So what they wanted is they never wanted the supply chain to shut down. So it required going through, doing a detailed analysis of the supply chain. The worst risk is a single source, single technology in a single plant. A sole source a sole source, nowhere else to get it, single plant, single technology, and if you don't have it, there's nowhere else to get it. That's the worst risk you have. So how many of those do you have, and what is the mitigation plan? That's something you can measure. Incremental revenue from supplier innovation. So, this measures, how much revenue did you get because the supplier helped you innovate, build a process, build a product, and bring in a revenue idea, or even solve a problem for you. In my career, I had a unrelated supplier that had a solution to a problem we had, and he gave us the technology to solve it. Prior to that, we had only 68% yield, and when the supplier gave us a solution, the yield went up to 98%. So that's an important thing. Today, people are really stretching terms. I've seen terms that range from 30 days all the way up to 180 days. And payment terms is something that some companies are measuring now to see how much cash are they generating, and how quickly are they generating that cash. And they're doing that. I'll give you an example of a bad metrics. I had a client once that their customer was paying him in 75 days, and they were paying the supplier in 19 days. So we want to know that, and we can improve that because we should be aligned in payment with the supplier. On-time supplier deliveries are given as long as you work within the lead time. All right. If it's something that you've done, then that metrics could be funny. Supplier lead time reduction is really important. So we want to make sure that we drive lead time reduction. We really don't want to have a lot. We want to have instant supply when we want it. We want flexibility in the supplier. So I can give you an example of how you can impact that. I had a supplier that had a 6-month lead time on motors. And when we dug into the situation, they had a special shaft in the motor. It was a standard motor with a special shaft, and it took them that long to get the shaft. So the simple solution was to buy the shafts and get them to the supplier on consignment, and then the lead time went from 6 months to a week. So big change. Measurement of supplier quality and performance, that's going to be in conjunction with your business and how you run it. And then purchasing cycle time, which is how long does it take to get from a requisition to an order. I've seen cycle times that were as long as 3 weeks in some companies, and hopefully you have a P2P system like Zycus that's going to expedite that purchasing cycle time. How many implemented cost savings did you have? How many are realized? We talked about that before. Oh, supplier rationalization. I told you, I gave you an example of a food company that had 365,000 suppliers. They didn't have a concentration of suppliers and supply base. I had another one that was in the chemical business, and on one chemical, they had $100 million in spend, and they probably had about 900 suppliers. The number one supplier in the industry only had $10 million. So, the company was not rationalizing and was not really getting the leverage out of the spend that they had. And then you can measure contract compliance. How many times on the indirect side do you have Maverick spend, and then you can actually build some metrics around closing down the Maverick spend. Zero-based measurement is one that I like. That's where sometimes I'll go into companies. We'll freeze the price where it is. We'll measure all of the increases and all of the decreases, and we'll look at what the net of the business is. So how well did that business perform against increases and decreases, and we measure to, let's say, January 1st. So we look at what it was January 1st, and then we measure from that point to the next year. And the following year, reset it. So it's kind of like, what have you done for me lately? And then if we look at some supply chain metrics, there's order accuracy, the percentage of the orders that are error-free. There's customer order cycle time, how long does it take to deliver to a customer. Inventory turnover shows how quickly inventory cycles turn. and hopefully you're turning a lot faster. The cash-to-cash cycles, the number of days between paying for materials and getting paid, and I gave you an example of a company that paid its bill in 19 days, did get paid for 75. So that's one where you look at that, and you can actually take these outliers and fix them. Cycle time, how long would it take to fill a custom order if inventory levels were 0? And the calculations here, and I know that Zycus is going to make this public for you so you can have all of these metrics. Fill rate's another one. You know, I had someone that was working for a U.S. retailer, and the fill rate expectation was 99% on-time full, and they were missing it, and it was a major retailer who actually fined them significantly the second time that the fill rate was missed. And that one required, once we figured out why it was being missed, it was being missed because the retailer was giving them every sale out of every cash register every day, and they were putting it in a drawer, and they didn't know what to do with it. But the retailer was saying, I tell you what I use, you know what you sent, technically you should know what I need, and you should always fill my orders full. And the retailer was right. So that brings me almost to the end of the process. How well does your team perform? So is cost and value measured correctly? Do you have metrics in place for cost and value? And do you have the right metrics in place for productivity and efficiency? And then have you started to think about how can you measure value? Speed to market, velocity, flexibility of the supply chain. How are you going to measure risk? Do you have a predictive model for risk? Have you mapped out the supply chain? And I think you want to look at every company is different. All right, every company has different criteria, different metrics, different processes. So you got to pick the metrics that are going to be most meaningful to your organization and the customer. And then the question I really have is, what metrics do you use? Are they generating continuous improvement? Are you getting the best results from your process? Those are the kinds of things that we're trying to drive, and I think that, you know, we have to really start thinking about those things. And so hopefully what I've done is I've exposed you to metrics, all metrics around the process. I've focused in on what CEOs are looking for from purchasing and supply chain. I kind of brought you to the competence matrix so you can start thinking about, do we have the right competence and are we getting the right results? Talked about how to build the right KPIs, and then I gave you some examples of metrics that other companies are using. So hopefully that's going to help you. I'll say this again, I love Dr. Deming. Without data, you're just another person with an opinion. What gets measured gets managed. Okay, so I'm open for questions.
Yeah, Bill, there are a few questions we have received so far. The first is, what metrics can you put on value? Can you please elaborate on that?
Oh, sure. I think you have to look at one, you know, can you change the speed to market? So, you know, I am currently working in the home building market. So if it takes 60 days to build a house, can we change that cycle time to 45? Because it's all about the speed at which you get it done, and the ability to recapture some of the investment you have in the land, the materials, the labor. So that's just one of them. But another one would be, you know, how do you get incremental service? Or, you know, is innovation bringing you? You know, are suppliers required to give you innovation, and have they brought any innovation to you? And what's the incremental revenue or the reduction in cost that supplier's brought you in revenue? In fact, in Australia, I was working with one of the big mining companies, and what they said is they wanted a 5% reduction in cost. And what they told the suppliers, and it was a big meeting, and we had the Minister of Mining, what they told those suppliers is, you don't have to come in and give me a check for the 5%, but you do have to come in with, how are you going to change the process? How are you going to improve the product? what value are you going to bring that's going to drive 5%? So you can do it in the 5% equivalent, or you can do it in cash. So there's some examples of how you measure value, and if a supplier comes in and they increase the speed of your process or the yield of your process, or give you more services, or support your indirect customers, and maybe they take over a function like office supplies or something like that across the business. All those things are measurable. All those things you can put a number on.
Right. So the next question, Bill, for you is, why don't management like to measure cost avoidance?
Back to that one. People really try to use cost avoidance as a savings. So let's go back to the example I gave in terms of, you got an 8% increase, you negotiated 3% out, all right? So you have a 5% increase and a 3% avoidance, but you didn't get any money. You still have an increase in cost. Or that piece of capital you negotiate, you didn't spend any money to begin with. So CEOs, the C-level people, really like to see real money. And when we talk about avoidance, avoidance is important. It's important to say, look, if I wasn't here, this would have been the impact on your business, but it really isn't a cost savings. And most C-level CFOs and COOs and CEOs will acknowledge that you did the avoidance, but they want to see real money.
Okay. So the next question here is, how many metrics are ideal?
I like 3 to 4. I like 3 to 4 important metrics that are going to generate some changes. In my food career, I had a supplier that had we were in the pickle business, and I had a supplier making pails. And one of the things that we would always see is in our customer's warehouse, the pail would crack at the bottom. So we sat down and we told the supplier the only thing we want him to do is tell us, put statistical process control in, and tell us when he runs out of the specification. And what that supplier learned through the mapping, and what we both learned, is that that pail was 3 pounds, and by the time the resin got to the top, it had already solidified at the bottom, and it was hard to push it in. So the operators were jamming up the pressure to get it in. They'd create a weak spot. When he finally got the settings on the machine right, and the operator told the operators to leave it alone, he saved $500,000 in material, and we never had one crack again. So I like to see 3 or 4. I like to make them meaningful. I want to see corrective action or something get fixed. And you can do that in indirect too. In terms of travel, you can look at compliance. You can look at how many times a traveler is stranded. You can look at all the kinds of things that that will improve both the supplier and the customer reaction.
Great. So the last question for today is, can you provide an example of why suppliers should be included in the creation of metrics?
Oh, yeah. Well, I gave one in the webinar about glass, but I think that the supplier has to buy in to the metrics. I think the supplier has to be part of it. I think the supplier has a lot of knowledge about their process, about what their capability is, and hopefully they get a lot of knowledge about how you use it. And then together you can build metrics that are going to improve the process, improve the product, improve the service every day. And by the end of the period of time, and you really need to go over the metrics with the suppliers. I think once a quarter you need to go over the metrics. You need to sit down. We need to make sure what's working, what's not working, what are we doing. I didn't talk about the feedback sessions, but it's critical that if you make these metrics together and you work together on the feedback, you're going to work together and get continuous improvement, and it's going to make your business better. Just by one, you don't have to fight about who's right and who's wrong about the way we measure, and then second, we're all together. We're all in it to make things better. Because if you make it better, you improve the quality, you speed up the process. It's better for the supplier as well, because that's going to impact the rest of his customer base, and he can take that improvement out. And if it does, if it's a cost saving for him, he may have to pass that to you, but he may not have to pass it on to the rest of his customers. So I think it's really, really critical that you do 3 or 4 meaningful metrics, and you have a good review process that delivers some results. If it's not working, then you have to look at the metric again and change it.
Great. So with that, we come to the end of this webinar. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Bill, for this awesome presentation. If any of you want to reach Bill, you can find the contact information on your screen right now. Thanks for joining us again. Have a nice day.
Thank you.
Thank you.